Let's talk about OverTriggers. Now, if you don't want to watch the entire video, I'll make it really easy. OverTriggers in premium? Not a premium problem. OverTriggers in every format? A problem. Does that mean Overdress bad? No. Overdress looks amazing, despite OverTriggers. That doesn't mean OverTriggers are good. It means all the good of Overdress outweighs the bad of OverTriggers. It's like we're in this beautiful paradise of Overdress, where everything is amazing, but there's a small third on the grass. Let's unpack why. First, a rule. When we discuss this, it's not about how much fun you're having in a casual setting. You can find OverTriggers fun, just like you may find Uno fun, or you may find drunkenly walking through traffic fun. But in this video, we talk about the effect on competitive play and the competitive viability of the game. So let's create some context. Chapter 1. Competitive viability of a game. What is it? To me, the number one factor to judge the competitive viability of a game is how often do better players perform better than worse players. Why is this important? Well, if better players consistently perform better than worse players, this means there is incentive to get better. Improvement of your skills will lead to more won matches, perhaps tops at major events, and perhaps even a trip to the World Championship. If worse players beat better players too often, there is no reason for you to try and get better. Why would you try if it's all in vain anyway? Take this theoretical game, where both players grab a deck of poker cards and both draw a card. Whoever has the highest card wins. This game is clearly entirely luck-based. Is there incentive for you to practice for this game? Do you feel like it is a competitively viable game? No. Of course not. Compare this to a game like basketball or chess. Clearly, the better player, relatively consistently, beats the worse player. So there is a lot of incentive to get better. These games are competitively very viable. Card games usually dance around the center of this spectrum. They have an element of luck to them, while simultaneously having an element of skill to them. Poker is the same way. Some may argue that the luck element is too large, whilst others will argue good players still do well consistently, so clearly the skill still outweighs the luck factor. Wherever you lie on this spectrum doesn't really matter, as long as we can all agree that competitive viability hinges on the consistency with which good players perform better than worse players in competitions. Now that we created the necessary context, let's break down the impact of OverTriggers on a game of Vanguard. We'll start with the abilities printed on individual OverTriggers themselves, then go into their offensive impact, and finally finish by analyzing their defensive impact. After that, we will cover counter arguments. Chapter 2. The impact of OverTriggers, the abilities. If you aren't aware of how an OverTrigger even works mechanically, let me quickly refresh that. When you drive check an OverTrigger, you bind the OverTrigger, draw a card, give 100 million power to one of your units, and then resolve the ability that is printed on the OverTrigger. If you damage check an OverTrigger, you bind the OverTrigger and give 100 million power to one of your units without resolving the other ability printed on the OverTrigger. So far, we have only seen 6 OverTriggers abilities. They are mostly all strong effects, and depending on when they are checked, will have a major impact on the game. Obviously, the player who triggers the Dark States trigger on turn 1 will have a much larger advantage than the player who doesn't. Overall, I feel OverTrigger abilities could definitely spin out of control if we start getting more and more powerful ones, because the baseline from which they have started is already incredibly high. But their effects so far are actually not my primary concern just yet. Regardless, it is true that a worse player can and will be the player from a well-timed ability of an OverTrigger sometimes. We can argue about how often this would happen all day, but the fact of the matter is it can happen. However, I would like to keep your attention away from the written abilities currently, as with the ones revealed so far, I still believe a far more crucial problem comes into play later in this video. Chapter 3. The impact of OverTriggers offensively. When I say offensively, I am of course talking about drive checking them and using them to bash your opponent's skulls in. It is not hard to see how checking a trigger that gives 100 million power is essentially an automatic 1 or 2 damage depending on critical triggers and so forth if your opponent does not have a perfect guard in hand. They might have guarded perfectly to withstand a 30,000 power rear guard attack, but did not draw the perfect guard to withstand 100 million power. It's also possible that you're playing a deck like Overlord, where your Vanguard is already attacking at least twice. Your opponent may have been hoarding 2 perfect guards for this very occasion, only to then be met with a well-timed Dragon Empire OverTrigger that suddenly turns the turn from guardable to unguardable, resulting in a RNG or luck assisted loss. While the offensive impact of an OverTrigger certainly already adds luck-based victories to the game, and thus already backs up the point that OverTriggers are negative for the competitive viability of the game, as worse players will sometimes beat better players because of them. The actual true issue with them comes to light in the next chapter. Chapter 4. The impact of OverTriggers defensively. Like mentioned before, when your opponent attacks you and you damage check an OverTrigger, it will bind itself away and then give 100 million power to one of your units. It's essentially a heal that triggers no matter how much damage your opponent has, but it also effectively ends your opponent's turn. What do I mean by that? Imagine you're about to attack with 5 units which each have 50,000 power. Your first unit attacks and your opponent damage checks an OverTrigger. Your next 4 attacks of 50,000 power will not be hitting, as the opponent's Vanguard is now 100 million power. Your opponent does not have to guard any of them, and beyond on-attack skills that you may still have, your entire turn has essentially been invalidated. This means you now have to pass the turn to the opponent without having changed anything about their hand. You might have won this turn had they not triggered that OverTrigger, but now they get a turn instead. If your hand isn't big enough to live through their turn, what would have been a win just changed into a loss. A well-timed defensive OverTrigger is essentially a free turn, except for the +2 or +3 that the other player got from drive checks and the like. But all of that is easily offset by the many cards that weren't required to guard on the other side of the table. A free turn may not sound like much to some, but it's actually a game-changing advantage. It's rolling a die, and if you hit a 1, you get a free Chronovisor heritage skill added onto whatever your deck already does. Even the worst players can beat the best players if they can randomly get a free turn at the right time. A large majority of the time, a win or a loss is decided by less than an entire turn of advantage. If you want to test this for yourself, try playing some games against your friends where they get to decide when they can take an extra turn at the cost of you drawing 2 cards. Feel free to make it 3 or even 4 cards. You will find the advantage of the free turn, if timed well, has incredible impact. Does that mean a defensive OverTrigger automatically wins the game every time? No, but that's not a requirement for it to be problematic. Even if it shifts the win rate only slightly, and I'd argue it does more than just slightly, that is still a net negative for the competitive viability of the game, as worse players will beat better players more than before the inclusion of the mechanic, sliding your game more to the luck-based side of the spectrum. You can argue about how much it slides, but the fact of the matter is that it does. Now, let's address some counter-arguments. A good player will still win despite it. Sometimes, yes, but other times, no. Players seem to misunderstand how close games of Vanguard usually are. A large majority of games, the game hinges on the one final turn. That one final push where your hand is running out, but you still have this one turn to win. A good player usually does not have 20 cards more than their opponent. A good player will usually not be able to give their opponent a free turn 3 or 4 and still win after. A good player tends to make slightly more optimal plays than others consistently enough to where they compound into a statistically significant but not overwhelming advantage. And that not overwhelming part is very, very important. If you had to rate players by skill level from 1 to 10, will an OverTrigger make a 10 out of 10 player lose to a 1 out of 10 player who can barely read their cards? No, probably not. But will 3 out of 10 players sometimes randomly win against a 10 out of 10 player because of these? Yes, they absolutely will. Once again, OverTriggers don't need to be auto wins 100% of the time to be a bad competitive mechanic. If they slide the game from less impacted by luck to more impacted by luck, the game is objectively becoming less competitively viable. Now, a second part of this misconception would go something along the lines of this. Why are you crying about this? You will win from one just as often as you will lose from one, so it's fair. Firstly, it doesn't actually feel good to win due to sheer luck. You want a win to feel deserved. When a win comes from a well-timed OverTrigger, when you really know you weren't supposed to win that game, it feels incredibly undeserved. But secondly, and more importantly, this is false. A better player would generally beat a worse player without an OverTrigger regardless. But the OverTrigger can swing the favor to the worse player, where an OverTrigger on the better player's side, swinging a win into a bigger win, isn't relevant in a tournament setting. You do not get bonus points for winning hard. This mechanic will therefore benefit worse players disproportionately. Another argument for OverTriggers is OverTriggers changing the game does not happen often, it's only a one-off. But once again, that does not matter, because it does happen. People who dislike OverTriggers aren't saying it happens often or that the game becomes 40% worse because of it. They are saying that the 2%, or however much percent you think, of the time where it happens makes the game that 2% worse. Is it a lot? Not necessarily, but that's not where the argument lies. A mechanic making a game 2% less competitively viable is still a net negative. The inclusion of the mechanic was still negative for the game's competitive viability, even if its impact is limited. Again though, I am not so convinced that it is only 2%, but that's not where the argument lies. If tomorrow Bushiroad announced an order that you can play once and it lets you roll a die, and if it lands on a 6, you automatically win the game, this would not be a popular mechanic, nor would it be considered good game design. Would it change games very often? No, but it doesn't need to change games very often to still be a negative for the game as a whole. The final argument defending OverTriggers is Vanguard already had RNG anyway. Why does this matter? And this is essentially a non-argument. One bad already existing does not justify another bad being added on top. It's not because people die every day that you can justify killing a few more yourself. Proponents of this argument will often bring up heal triggers already existing or critical triggers already existing, and while a 6 damage heal certainly feels bad, it is actually still much easier to overcome than a 6 damage overtrigger. Adding a 5th heal to the game would already be adding more luck-based losses to the game and thus also be a net negative for competitive viability of the game, already proving the point that overtriggers are worse than no overtriggers for competitive viability of a game. But on top of that, there are plenty of games where a good player can still overcome a defensive trigger or even a defensive heal, where overcoming a 100 million power defensive trigger in a single turn is simply mathematically impossible unless your deck can reach infinite power. Finally, I have seen some discourse online where players claim overtriggers are a problem in Premium specifically, but not in the Overdress format. This is false. As illustrated in this video, the problem with overtriggers does not stem from interactions with other cards. The problem with overtriggers stems from random losses being caused by their inclusion in the game. This is a reality in both the Overdress format and the Premium format. Some people try to bring up overtrigger combos in Premium that simply aren't relevant. Ultima, Platina Ezel, or other Oracle Think Tank trigger control cards are mentioned as toxic or broken, but the fact of the matter is that all these interactions so far are either entirely luck-based, way too slow, dog shit, or a combination of all of these. Overtriggers are not a problem specifically in Premium. Anyone saying they are either hasn't tested yet or is living in a future where we received some even more broken abilities on overtriggers. But the reality of the situation is that overtriggers are a problem in every single format where they are legal. This is not a Premium problem, it is an everything problem. In conclusion, overtriggers are a negative for the competitive viability of the game. Is that net negative huge? Probably not. Overdress still looks amazing so far, and I'm still incredibly excited for it. But that doesn't mean we need to pretend like everything is perfect. Not everything needs to be perfect for Overdress to be an amazing chapter in Vanguard's life. Overtriggers can be a bad mechanic in an amazing game, and that stance is totally justifiable. I hope you found this interesting. Feel free to like, comment, and perhaps even share it with someone when you battle them to the death in a great overtrigger debate. I will see you soon. Ciao.